fire had been lit. In 1957, a small group of riders in Prince George's County, Maryland, stitched a figure from Norse mythology onto the backs of their leather jackets and called themselves the Pagans Motorcycle Club. But a patch alone does not create power. Symbols inspire loyalty. Structure sustains it. But power, real power, comes from territory. And territory on the East Coast was different. Unlike the long, open highways of the American West, the East was compact, dense, layered with history. Cities pressed against one another. States separated by short stretches of road. Industrial corridors connected ports to rail lines to factories, factories to neighborhoods. If you controlled territory here, you didn't just control a road. You controlled access, movement, influence. And the pagans understood that early. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the pagans did not explode outward in dramatic fashion. They did not attempt to dominate headlines. They did not rush to plant flags across the country. They consolidated. Maryland first, then Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Each new chapter was deliberate. Each expansion calculated. Growth was not measured only by numbers. It was measured by cohesion. A new chapter meant more riders, yes, but it also meant more responsibility, more exposure, more visibility, and visibility required discipline. You did not simply join the pagans. You prospected. Prospects were tested in quiet, unglamorous ways. They ran errands. They showed up early. They stayed late. They absorbed the culture before they were permitted to represent it. Loyalty was observed over time. Weakness was identified and removed before it could destabilize the group. Inside the club, hierarchy was clear. President, vice president, sergeant at arms, treasurer, road captain. Every role carried weight. Every decision flowed through a chain of authority. This was not chaos disguised as rebellion. It was order, internal, structured, disciplined. Hierarchy builds longevity, and longevity builds influence. Outlaw motorcycle culture developed differently on the East Coast than it did in California. The West Coast had media mythology, sunlit highways, Hollywood imagery, public fascination. Names like the Hells Angels would become embedded in American pop culture. The East Coast had pressure, older cities, established street networks, dense populations, existing organized crime structures, a higher concentration of law enforcement agencies operating within tight geographic boundaries. Operating here required strategy. Reputation became currency. On the East Coast, news travels quickly. A confrontation in one county is discussed in another by nightfall. A display of weakness in one bar can ripple across multiple states. Over time, law enforcement agencies began describing the pagans as one of the more unpredictable of the major outlaw motorcycle clubs operating in the United States. Not the largest, not the most publicized, but highly territorial. And in outlaw culture, territorial discipline can matter more than size. The pagans were building a regional identity that was tightly anchored to geography. They weren't chasing national celebrity. They were reinforcing presence where it counted. Outlaw clubs do not exist in isolation. Territory lines are invisible, but they are understood. As the decades passed, other major motorcycle clubs began expanding eastward. Expansion is natural in any organization seeking growth. But when expansion paths cross, tension follows. Bars became neutral ground until they weren't. Rallies became demonstrations of presence. Who arrived first? Who arrived in greater numbers? Who left last? Patches became statements. Respect matters in outlaw culture, but perceived disrespect matters more. A glance held too long. A word spoken too casually. A refusal to acknowledge territory. These moments can escalate quickly in environments built on reputation. While the full-scale conflicts that would later define East Coast rivalries were still developing, the groundwork was already being laid. The East Coast was no longer quiet. It was competitive, and competition requires readiness. External tension can fracture an organization unless the internal structure is strong. Inside the pagans, loyalty was not optional. Members answered to leadership. Leadership answered to the collective structure. Rules were enforced internally, often quietly. Disputes were not handled in public view. Discipline, when required, was managed within the organization. The goal was stability. Structure kept the club aligned across chapters. Alignment preserved reputation. Reputation preserved territory. As the club grew, maintaining unity across state lines became increasingly important. Communication between chapters strengthened. Leadership roles carried heavier burdens. The further an organization expands, the more fragile it can become, unless the code holds. And for decades, the Pagans' internal code allowed them to maintain cohesion across a growing footprint. But growth always brings attention. By the 1980s and 1990s, federal law enforcement across the United States began intensifying its focus on outlaw motorcycle clubs. Organized crime task forces expanded. Surveillance operations became more sophisticated. Racketeering statutes, particularly the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, provided new legal tools. Investigations were no longer aimed solely at individuals. They targeted entire structures. Clubs were increasingly viewed not simply as social groups, but as organizations that could be prosecuted collectively if patterns of criminal activity were established. The East Coast, with its dense jurisdictions and overlapping agencies, became a complex enforcement landscape. And as the Pagans' presence expanded, so did scrutiny. Public perception shifted. Media coverage sharpened. The club that once operated regionally began appearing in national conversations about organized outlaw motorcycle culture. Pressure does not always arrive in dramatic form. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through surveillance, indictments, informants, and legal strategy. The microscope was tightening. Expansion creates power, but power attracts pressure. Balancing growth while maintaining internal control became critical for the Pagans as the 1990s approached their end. Chapters had to remain aligned. Leadership had to remain respected. Reputation had to remain intact. In outlaw culture, weakness invites challenge, and challenge invites conflict. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the East Coast landscape was changing rapidly. Demographics shifted. Law enforcement coordination improved. Rival clubs adjusted strategies. Alliances formed and dissolved. The quiet foundation built in a Maryland garage in 1957 had evolved into something far larger than its founders likely imagined. What began as consolidation had become regional dominance. What began as brotherhood had become infrastructure. What began as fire stitched onto leather had become a territorial presence woven into the East Coast itself. Every empire reaches a point where growth meets resistance. For the Pagans, that moment was approaching. Federal investigations were intensifying. Rival clubs were pressing into shared spaces. Public narratives were hardening. The East Coast was no longer a corridor of quiet consolidation. It was contested ground. The fire that began in Prince George's County was no longer contained within garages and backrooms. It had spread across state lines, across highways, across decades. And once identity hardens into structure, and structure anchors into territory, it becomes very difficult to uproot. The Norse fire was no longer symbolic. It was strategic. Next episode, federal pressure, how investigations reshaped the club.